Hi, I'm Meta Spencer, and today we're going to go to Delhi, New Delhi, India, which is a real treat these days. I'm going to visit with Richa Kumar, who is an associate professor in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Indian Institute of Technology in Delhi. And we're going to talk about India's agricultural reforms. As you may have read in the paper, there's a lot of controversy about what India needs to do to improve the production of food. Good morning, Richa.
Good morning, Professor Mehta. It's wonderful to be here with you.
Yeah, it's a real treat for me to get to go to India too. I haven't been in India for 30 years or so. What has been going on this last year or so as issues have arisen about how Indian farming should proceed in the future?
So the three laws that have been passed by the government, the first of them creates a single unregulated or freer market for agricultural produce across the country. So earlier, agricultural produce was sold in specific regulated market yards where private players and different traders would go and buy farmers' produce under some kind of auction rules and some kind of licensing. And that was done away with under the first law. The second law is about framing rules for contract farming, and this is especially to facilitate companies as well as startups to come into agriculture and work with farmers for specific commodities in different parts of the country. And the third law is about removing the ceiling on inventory holding or stocks. So the law was passed, 50, 60, 70 years ago at the time of independence to make sure that traders and others are not hoarding produce, food grains in particular. And that law has been changed to not allow, to allow greater stocks to be held. But what has also happened, although these laws were passed in the middle of last year, in the middle of 2020, they have been held in abeyance. So the laws have been suspended since earlier this year, thanks to an intervention by the Supreme Court of India. So at the moment, the laws are not in operation. These laws are in fact part of a now 30-year process of liberalizing Indian agriculture. So in the 1990s is when the different governments, not the present government, but other earlier governments and other political dispensations were trying to liberalize Indian agriculture, deregulate it, allow for more foreign investment or allow for more private entities to come in, deregulate markets. And in that process, these laws or some version of these laws has been on the anvil for at least 20 years, or definitely 15 years or so or more. And these laws are part of a larger process that is trying to, in some senses, dismantle the state support that farmers received under the Green Revolution. Right after India became independent in 1947, we were left with a colonial legacy of the British who were ruling over us. And that colonial legacy included, of course, a huge amount of taxation on agriculture, which was the primary source of revenue generation for the British. A huge decline in agricultural knowledge and practices, especially related to ecology and rainwater harvesting and water structures and cropping patterns, because the British shifted farming from food crops in particular to cash crops. So farmers were growing jute and opium and things that were then cotton that were exported rather than food grains, millets, things for themselves. And the third thing that the British left for us was a system of, rationing, thanks to World War II, where they had bifurcated the country into two different portions, where states which were producing surplus grain and states producing deficit grain. And they had controlled entirely the movement of food grains. And so there were areas that actually did not have enough food grain to feed themselves within the country.
Now,
Now,
that is what led, I presume, we're leading up to talking about that famine, especially in Bengal, right?
yes. So the Bengal famine was really during the World War. And that, originally was under, the food availability decline theory, saying that, Indian agriculture, Indian farmers are not productive enough to feed themselves. But as Professor Amartya Sen's, Nobel Prize winning work showed us, that in fact, the problem was not of production. There was above normal production in the year of the famine, which is 1943. This is pre-independence. That famine happened because the British actually exported a lot of the grain to Africa to feed their soldiers and did not allow grain from other surplus provinces like Punjab to go to Bengal. And so it was really a famine of policy rather than a famine due to natural causes or production causes. So similarly, actually, if you go after independence, what the biggest change that the Indian government does, well, of course, apart from getting rid of all the taxation, trying to promote the production of food crops, there is also a lot of investment that flows into agriculture. And there is a clear effort to move food grain to places which need it, which if you go back also about 120 years, 140 years actually, to the famines from 1870 to 1903, when 30 million people, that's 30 million people in India died. This is known as the Great Victorian Holocaust. British government records tell us that 13 million people died, 1-3. This is official data. And Indian economists and demographers have calculated about 30 million people died. I mean, we had a demographic catastrophe.
This was the result of British policies.
This was a result of British policies of exporting grain in the time of famine, of destroying water and ecologically suitable agricultural cropping patterns, forcing people to grow cash crops. What new revisionist historical work is showing us that this was a complete mischaracterization of the 1950s and the 60s in this country. It was basically looking at things from colonial lens. For the British, it worked to characterize the country as, agriculturally unproductive and the farmers as ignorant and backward. But in fact, a lot of it was about taxation policy and, ecologically inappropriate agricultural practices. And then the Americans come to us and say, well, we have PL 480. You want to industrialize? Here's cheap food you can give to your, the workers in your cities. In fact, not just cheap food, it was free food because we paid for it in rupees. In fact, all over Asia and Africa, many countries.
We're talking about the Green Revolution now, or we're talking?
No, we are talking about before the Green Revolution, how the Americans provided food aid. Okay. And this food aid also helped to create the larger impression that India couldn't feed herself. Mm-hmm. And then in the middle of the 60s, we became dependent on American food aid to supply to our cities and industrial areas in the country. We didn't actually focus on developing our agriculture in the same way. We didn't invest much in agriculture eventually because we were focused on industrialization. Mm-hmm. And because of that, when the Americans got upset with us, with India didn't support them in the Vietnam War, we had a war with Pakistan, which the Americans were unhappy about. So then they said, then food aid became a lever in foreign policy. So then they said, okay, we are not going to give you food aid. This was in 1965. And this was also, they linked it to certain conditions. They said, well, you stop the war with Pakistan, you devalue your rupee, you become self-sufficient in food grains. So you adopt, highly productive farming, which is Green Revolution type farming practices. You bring in fertilizers, chemicals, high-yielding variety seeds. Only then we will support you with food aid. And India then that same year, there were a certain set of conjunctures, especially in terms of there was a drought in the country. So we had deficit rainfall. And in certain parts of the country, especially, poorer sections of society found it harder to access food grain. Since we were dependent on the Americans to supply that food grain, we had to listen to them. And so that created conditions for the Green Revolution policy shift. Mm-hmm. Now, within a couple of years, we were having bumper harvests again. So by 1968, the weather conditions change and you have bumper harvests across all crops. The Green Revolution support was only for wheat in the beginning, later on for rice. But we are back to good production But now we are on the path and we are part of this larger narrative that India was importing food without PL 480, it could not feed herself, and its agriculture was unproductive, and only the Green Revolution could actually save India from certain disaster. So that was the narrative which people accepted, and which is in fact still accepted by a large number of people within India. So we still believe that the Green Revolution was a Faustian bargain that we had to do. And we had to do this because, on the one hand, we were starving, we needed these high yielding variety seeds and everything that came with them. But on the other hand, of course, as we know, that these high yielding variety seeds with their fertilizers, with their pesticides, with the monoculture technological treadmill have created ecological disaster and have created huge health consequences for our population. In terms of the toxicity of the soil, the toxicity of the water, depleting water tables. There is a cancer train in Punjab that sends cancer patients to these cancer hospitals, 500 kilometers away. So those impacts are considered to be an inevitable but necessary bargain that we had to do.
How much harm and how much benefit did come from it, and what should have been done instead?
In hindsight, what we can say is that the way the Green Revolution was implemented in the country, it was implemented. Well, the first important shift that it created was a shift from mixed cropping systems to monoculture farming. So you went from a farm that was growing millets, which is grains, oil seeds, which is oils, pulses, which is protein, lentils, and a whole host of other things in intercropping, mixed cropping patterns, to a field that is growing only one thing, which was in this case either wheat or eventually rice. And in Punjab, in the rainy season, you grew wheat. Sorry, in the rainy season, you grew rice, and in the winter season, you grew wheat. And it turned into a rice wheat cropping pattern with no other crop in the system. In the beginning, your seeds will be fine, but nature doesn't work on uh, a single variety. When you want to grow a single thing on the farm, you need to make sure that no everything else becomes a weed, everything else becomes a pest, and you have to destroy it. So that's when you need your fertilizers, well, to of course also make sure all the nutrition goes to that one thing that you want, and everything else has to be killed. So you need your pesticides and your weedicides for that. But eventually the pests will develop pesticide resistance, and you need stronger and stronger, more potent pesticides, and your seeds will become diseased over time. So then you need newer seeds coming from the scientific establishment or from companies, and your soil will become depleted, and so your fertilizer will not do the same job anymore.
So the disadvantages were not as apparent at the beginning as they gradually became.
So they were known to the scientific community, but they were not publicized or popularized, and farmers were not exactly provided with complete information about this. It basically led to rising input costs for farmers. They would need to buy more and more expensive pesticides, more fertilizer. Water tables started going down because they were using groundwater, and that was all getting depleted. So you have rising costs on the one hand. The second set of consequences were related to the marketing of the product of farmers. And in this case, the government, because the seeds that were provided were of wheat and later on rice, the government gave the farmers a guarantee of output purchase. So they said that at a certain guaranteed minimum price, we will buy whatever you grow. Because remember, farmers who are growing 20 things, if one thing fails, they have something to fall back on. If you're growing one thing on the farm and that one thing is more risky to grow now, and if that fails, you're in trouble. And so the government then gave this output guarantee saying, whatever you grow, we'll give you the money, at least enough to cover your costs and some more. Now, the government only did this for rice and wheat because the seeds that were initially available were only for rice and wheat. But what that did was led to the farmers shifting completely from millets, pulses, and oil seeds, and a combination of that from grains, pulses, and oil seeds to only rice and wheat. So within less than 10 years, by the middle of the 1970s, early 1980s, India was overproducing rice and wheat. We had more than we could actually consume. But we started decreasing in the production of millets, which are known as the nutri cereals now, as well as in pulses, as well as in oil seeds. And so we had a different kind of a crisis, which was really a nutrition crisis. So the two consequences in summary there, one is an ecological crisis because the natural resource base on which farming is dependent upon is degraded very, very badly. And the nutritive consequences of the Green Revolution have led to a diet for Indians across the country that is very high in highly polished rice and wheat, and very much deficient in the healthier food grains like millets, as well as deficient in pulses and oil seeds. Millets we are hardly growing. Pulses and oil seeds we have been importing. So the irony, right? There is a huge irony underlying the Green Revolution, that we call ourselves self-sufficient in food, but we are really self-sufficient or overly sufficient in rice and wheat. But we have been importing pulses or lentils and oil seeds from 1992 onwards, to the tune of a huge proportion of our requirement, 30 to 40%, in some years 70 to 80% of our needs for pulses and oil seeds are imported. So
Really?
that's the real important part of nutrition, right? So we have a totally lopsided nutrition basket because of the Green Revolution. For any farmer who shifted to this monoculture system of farming, a single crop in the field, they saw over the years ecological degradation in their farm. They saw rising input costs, and they saw output guarantees not covering that cost. So when your cost is going up, but the price that you're getting for your farm product is not enough to cover the cost, what you basically end up is in debt. And so across the country, farmers are one of the social groups that are indebted to the highest degree.
As I've heard that there's, I don't understand this, but lots of farmers were committing suicide. But my impression is that Punjab is the richest part of the farming territory. The best farming goes on in Punjab. So where is this suicide business happening? And is it connected at all, or is that a separate matter?
It's absolutely connected, because the story of indebtedness is deeply linked to the story of suicide. And Punjab, surprisingly, or perhaps not so surprisingly, you're right in saying it's been the state with the best form of agriculture and most remunerative in a sense, but it's also been the state which has been the hot spot for suicide. And the logic, as I was trying to explain, is that initially the government was purchasing the rice and wheat that these farmers were growing at a minimum support price. But over time, the government found itself, in a bind, because it had overflowing granaries. I mean, the farmers are producing 3 times what is required in terms of your national buffer stock. And so the government but it's stuck. In some senses, it's a deeply political issue, because the government can't suddenly, wash his hands off and say, well, we won't buy your crop, because then what will happen to it?
Mhm.
But the government was not able to increase the price of that product at the same rate as the cost was going up. So as debt increased and really spiraled out of control, farmers who were not, mostly farmers at the middle level, who didn't have enough land or didn't have enough family resources or networks to support them in servicing of that debt, those are the farmers ultimately who, it's been largely seen, there have been sociological studies on it, that risk, whereas in the past was something that was absorbed through joint family networks and kinship networks, has slowly become individualized. And individual farmers find this debt burden impossible to bear. You have banks coming to, auction off their land, or you have, other money lenders at the village also. There are lots of, socially difficult situations that individual farmers find it hard to deal with. And that has been the story of suicide across India, not just in Punjab. But it's been seen that where people have shifted to the so-called advanced agriculture, where where all your inputs are coming from outside, and you're basically commodifying all your inputs, so you need cash in hand to purchase those inputs, and the produce that you're selling, you're not getting a remunerative price for it. There, this indebtedness cycle is being seen, which is that, part of this modern agriculture is also about using modern technologies, tractors, harvesters, all of those machines, which cost a lot of money.
The only time I've been to India was in 1980, and I didn't see any tractors. My impression was that most farming in India was small individual plots of family farms or something of that kind, and that it would be for local consumption, maybe primarily for family consumption, but for a local market. Are you saying that much of the land has been consolidated into big enough holdings to make tractors a reasonable investment? I mean, a little farm with 2 acres is not going to have a tractor.
Surprisingly, the transition in India has not really been towards a consolidation of big holdings.
Oh.
Rather, what we have seen is a fragmentation of holdings due to demographic pressures, as land gets subdivided generation after generation. But and that's linked to this technological treadmill, that on the one hand, land parcels are coming down, but on the other hand, tractors have almost become ubiquitous on the Indian landscape, whether it's Punjab or whether it's other parts of the country. The way these things work is on a lease out model, that you buy one tractor and then you lease it out, or you go and do the work on other people's smaller plots along with your own plot. So you're absolutely right in saying that a tractor is completely unviable on a smaller plot. But many farmers who have smaller plots of land have in fact invested in these machines, and they are one large source of debt. But what you are increasingly also seeing is land leasing in. So larger farmers are leasing in land of smaller farmers around them to create a bigger parcel, to be able to then make monoculture farming viable for themselves. Because you're absolutely right, smaller plots don't quite work in the same way, especially for monoculture farming. Scale is very important, and scale is important not just in terms of the use of inputs, but especially in terms of the use of machinery.
All the changes that you're describing, none of them fit with what we're hearing about nowadays, the necessity of green carbon farming and so on. That when you talk about tractors and so on and monoculture, you're not talking about the things that need to be done to make agriculture sustainable and to reduce climate change.
That's absolutely right. In fact, the entire shift to modern agriculture has made us, India is actually a petroleum importing country.
Mm-hmm.
And fertilizer, phosphate, rock phosphate, is also imported by the country. We don't have it domestically. So this is one of the other ironies of self-sufficiency. But we also became import dependent on fertilizers, as well as for these tractors, the petroleum to run them and the other material to manufacture them. That is also coming from outside. And of course, agriculture has become a carbon emitting sector. You may have possibly heard of issues related to stubble burning in Punjab. So farmers in Punjab have been growing rice. As farmers found harvesters to be very useful in harvesting paddy, but harvesters cut the paddy stalk from 2 feet over the ground, and so you have these long 2 feet stalks left on the field, which when laborers used to cut the paddy by hand, this is rice, they would cut it very small, and then you could simply sow the next crop on it. Now farmers burn that stubble, the agricultural residue, and that's creating toxic air pollution for the villages across Punjab, but also for the rest of North India. And the one more point I wish to add, you spoke about this impression about Indian agriculture as certainly being small scale, which it is, family farm based, which it still predominantly is, but it's not quite appropriate to characterize it as predominantly for self-consumption and without really significant market linkages. Those market linkages have historically always existed. You go back 400 years ago, and Indian farmers and weavers were growing cotton, producing cotton cloth, the finest of muslins, and a whole variety of exotic textiles, which were being exported around the world. Spices were exported from the subcontinent.
Okay.
The difference now, however, is that all farm inputs are also coming from the market. Earlier, farm inputs were all local, right? So you used your own, you had a circular system because you had livestock which would replenish with their dung the fertility of the soil, or you harvested your crop, then the stalks were again fed back into the soil to improve the fertility. You did mixed cropping and crop rotations, but then you sold some portion of that to the market. Now the difference is that for becoming a farmer in the first place, you need to have money, cash, to buy all these inputs from the market, including your seeds. Earlier, you were saving seeds or exchanging seeds across these elaborate seed networks. And that makes, the question of debt and question of cash and commodification very important. And of course, you're selling your crop to a market that increasingly with liberalization in the last 30 years is a more volatile market. So if you're a cotton farmer, if you're a soybean farmer, all of these are internationally linked markets, and you're competing with farmers in North America, or you're competing with farmers in China, or you're competing with farmers in South America. So there is a different level of market integration, and what is critical here is a loss of control, a loss of autonomy over decision making in terms of how to work with your land, with your resources. Classical example in Punjab, see, these people have been growing rice and wheat because the government buys it. So they have a guaranteed purchaser. They know if they do this, somebody will buy it. Many farmers, they've been, farmers themselves have been suffering, and they themselves are trying to look for alternatives. They've tried to shift to growing maize, corn. That's also linked to certain, corporate investments in there to grow hybrid corn. And that is, again, monoculture hybrid corn has its own environmental issues.
But the government does guarantee to buy it or not?
The government doesn't buy the corn. So the corn is on the, the regular market that you have to go and sell it. And the prices of corn are influenced by a whole set of demand supply factors. So when the COVID crisis happened, early in the COVID crisis, I don't know if you may remember, this is, in March 2020, there was a whole, I don't know if it happened in other parts of the world, but it happened in India. There was this, a rumor, which of course was false, that COVID will happen to anybody who will eat chicken or eggs. And so there was a big dip in the poultry industry. And maize or corn is one of the most important inputs for the poultry industry. So the demand from the poultry industry crashed. And these farmers who had shifted to maize, they were like, they were completely stuck. Their maize was hardly selling or at very, very low prices. So farmers who were growing rice and wheat, despite the treadmill and despite the indebtedness, they still somehow managed. But the maize farmers just, really lost that year very badly. So that's the issue. Farmers, then they feel, okay, I'm stuck in this cycle, but at least, I have something in my hand with this cycle. If I try something different, unless and until, coming back really to the question of the future now,
Sure.
if we do want to think about the climate emergency, which is really, I think year by year, as they say, the things that we thought will happen in 2050 might actually happen in 2030. Things are so bad on that front. Then it's very important for the government to support a shift away from the dominant model. Unfortunately, both the government as well as our larger scientific establishment, and I would also add the farmers. So the three large players in it, the government, the scientific establishment, and the farmers are sort of stuck in this dominant model of monoculture farming, which is rice wheat intensive. It's hard to shift away from that model. But as long as the government, because see, the government is still providing input subsidy and output guarantee for rice, wheat, and sugarcane. These three crops that are water guzzlers and that are distorting our nutrition and that we are overproducing and that are bad for the environment also.
What is crucial in this showdown between the protesting farmers and what the government has enacted in legislation?
Autonomy, where a large section of farmers feel that we have sort of survived thanks to these input subsidies and output guarantees of the government. And these have been farmers who have larger land holdings. They are from the better off sections of rural society, and they've also had a political voice historically. But what we have seen with deregulation and liberalization in the last 30 years, and these laws are in some senses a culmination of that, is an effort by the government to slowly do away with those input subsidies as well as reduce those output guarantees. These three laws are not per se doing that, but these three laws are certainly facilitating the entry of larger private players in the agricultural space, and larger private players who really want to operate at a certain level of scale. So that essential the third act which I described, which removes the limit on stock holding, will allow these companies then to hold large inventory stocks. The government is the biggest market mover and shaker of price. The worry is that as corporations come in and they become larger in terms of their ability to hold stock as well as work through contract farming with a large number of farmers or consolidate agriculture in a different kind of way, that will lead to terms of negotiation between these entities, between farmers and the private entities that are purchasing from them, will shift in a way that farmers will lose out the ability to negotiate and lose out the ability to ultimately get terms more suitable for their needs and for their livelihoods. In the name of efficiency, really, in some senses, equity will be sacrificed. That's the contention of the farmers. These laws are saying nothing about monoculture farming per se. They're really about the marketing side of things. So the monoculture farming model and its ecological problems will continue, and the indebtedness that farmers find themselves will continue on the production side. On the output side, on the marketing side, um, already most crops are not, the government doesn't buy everything, right? It only buys rice, wheat, and supports sugarcane. So already in other crops, farmers don't find that kind of support. But they feel that with the entry of these laws, perhaps even the rice, wheat, sugarcane support may eventually disappear. Although the government has been at a lot of pains to assure farmers that that's not going to be the case. They're going to continue to purchase rice and wheat, especially in Punjab. But the farmers have not really accepted that proposal of the government, and they worry that eventually all of the support will go. If the support goes, then farmers will become so indebted that eventually they may then have to sell off their land, lose their livelihood, and be no longer farmers anymore. It's really about being part of a model of agriculture that is so risky and that doesn't have any kind of cushion or support to help you tide over that risk. And that will then lead to indebtedness and land loss. So ultimately, for farmers, they see this as a question of survival. This is no longer just a question of farmers. This is a question of all of us who eat food. Anybody who eats food is very deeply, closely linked to this, and which is why large parts of the non-farming society in a state like Punjab has actually come out in support of the farmers. One may say, suppose the government decides to get rid of these laws and they say, okay, forget about it. We're done with it. We'll go back to what things were. Will that actually help these farmers in the long run? Well, the answer is no. because these laws, whether they are there or whether they are not there, they have nothing to do, like I said, with the production side of things and with the implications of monoculture farming, the
Mhm.
ecological as well as the livelihood and nutrition
Mhm.
and climate consequences of it. And if the laws are there, they will probably lead to greater exacerbation of the problems associated with the monoculture model.
If the farmer's own preferences are upheld, this will not help them in the long run.
Yes, because this is not really providing any roadmap for the future.
And the two things that I would worry about would be the productivity. How much food is being produced, say, per hectare, and is it good or is it bad? I've heard that Indian farming is not efficient in that sense, that it is not a very productive system of farming. And then the other part is, how sustainable is it? And neither of these seem to be affected directly by what you're saying the policy debate is about, is that whatever they will solve, it will be in terms of how much they get in the marketplace and how whether they can survive another year as farmers, etc. But it doesn't affect the general amount of food being produced, or the effect on the climate, or the sustainability and fertility of the soil. What would you, if you were in charge of making policy, what would you say and what would you do?
So the productivity question is a very, very important question. And the way you framed it, what is the yield per hectare, has been the dominant way to understand productivity of agriculture. Over the last 150 years or so, that's become the dominant metric. One of the first things we need to get away from is this very narrow measure of success in agriculture. And I know, of course, it's linked to the larger point about, how much food you will be able to produce. Can you feed, 9 billion people in 2050 and all of that broader narrative? And there are 2 points I wish to make on this. The first is that the first is really about this population question, and whether there is enough food that is being produced for everybody. And I want to historically situate that going back to the Green Revolution. One of the reasons for pushing the Green Revolution and also for people accepting the Green Revolution was this notion that there are too many people, too little food, and we need to ramp up food production. I'm sure, heard of the whole Malthusian story, right? Of the exponential rise of people and population and the linear rise in terms of food production.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, Professor Amartya Sen's work, as I explained earlier, and many other people following his work,
Professor
in
who?
different Amartya Sen,
Amartya Sen,
he's
yes.
the Nobel laureate,
Yes.
and many other people across, Asia, Africa, many other parts of the world have basically shown that this comparison between food and population is not an appropriate comparison, because you have to refract this using the element of price. That people ultimately starve and die because they are unable to afford to purchase food. Their entitlements fall, and they don't have enough either. They don't have enough money basically to buy food, and they don't have anything much left to exchange for that money, including their own labor power. And that usually is because there is mismanagement of food stocks. So if you go back historically, and that book I mentioned, Late Victorian Holocaust, it describes the Qing Empire, the Ming Empire in China. It describes the Mughal Empire in India, or other empires in South America. This 400 years back. How did those empires deal with food shortages? Because food shortage is not something abnormal, right? It's something that droughts are a natural phenomenon. Rains will fail, or climate will be different. And they all spoke about very important measures that rulers took to provide food in times of distress. There were granaries, and those granaries were opened up. Famine, as we now know, is a result, and this is classic case in Africa. There are so many now books written on this. that famine is really not about a production problem. Famine is actually about an entitlement problem, that people don't have access because either it's the food, there's a distribution issue, or it's a price issue. It's really never a production issue.
Mhm, mhm.
And in the Indian case, again, in the 1960s, there was nothing really to say. If you go back and really look at the production data, there's nothing to tell us that there wasn't enough production. And they didn't actually take into account all the foods that people in India were eating. We were a millet eating country predominantly, and they only counted rice and wheat, which actually wheat was hardly eaten by our population at that point of time. And they use the number of wheat to say, the amount of wheat to say that, oh, India doesn't have food to feed herself. Whereas we were eating 4 times more, 3 times more millets and 4 times more rice in the same year. So those numbers were not even included. So firstly, many of these calculations, like that 2059 billion people number, many of those calculations are based on certain assumptions about the kind of food that will be consumed in future. Especially, those 2050 calculations are assuming that the entire world will shift to a meat eating diet, and a meat eating diet based on meat production using the industrialized model of meat production. So we shouldn't be making those calculations using those numbers anyway. We should be using different kinds of numbers if you bring nutrition into the equation, or health into the equation. How are these assumptions made about how much food is required, what counts as food, and how you make assumptions about future diets of people. That's the first part. The second part is going back to your point about yield per acre. If you start calculating a productive farm based on a whole variety of things that the farm produces, not just in terms of multiple crops in a mixed cropping system, but also in terms of carbon sequestration and back into the soil, in terms of the ecosystem services that may be produced there, in terms of the biodiversity that may be conserved by the farm, and in terms of the healthy, nutritious food that it could grow and provide to people, then there is a very different kind of calculation at stake. So there's some very interesting experiments. I wouldn't say experiments, they are now at a much larger scale happening in India, where people are trying to measure not productivity of monocultures. So that's where the whole productivity debate fails, right? Because what you're trying to do is trying to compare a monoculture rice farm, or a monoculture apple orchard, or a monoculture, maize farm, with another monoculture farm without chemicals on it. Now, that is illogical. You cannot grow monocultures without chemicals. If you are going to ditch your chemicals, and if you want to become climate friendly and eco friendly, you have to go back to mixed farming. You have to grow multiple things on your farm. So what you really need to compare is, per unit of land, what is the total produce on that land versus the monoculture that you're growing on the other side. And those comparisons, of course, are far more complicated, and economists are spending a great deal of time trying to figure that out. But we need to compare apples to apples. And on that front, it's turning out that these mixed farms are far more productive, because what they are doing, very interestingly, is utilizing space in 3 dimensions. See, a monoculture farm is the same height and one crop. And a mixed farm is growing stuff underground. So you have roots and tubers under the ground. It's growing stuff, that grows at, half a foot, 2 feet, 3 feet. It also has trees on it, shorter trees, very tall trees. So there are so many different things that are also being harvested over time, not just once or twice a year. So that kind of calculation, of course, is more complicated, but that's the kind of, effort and work that is required to be done.
Now, how would you encourage the return to mixed farming in terms of government policy? What kind of legislation is required to reverse the trend that you've been describing?
So there are 2 ways to think about this. I think one of the concerns that have been one of the set of concerns that have been raised by farmers who are doing this kind of farming, and they call it natural farming. It's a bit of an oxymoron, but I think
natural
natural farming is what they call it, to work with nature.
All
And you
right.
farm according to your agroecological zone, what grows in your region, the kind of water availability and all of that. What grows in which season, what combines with what other stuff. One of their main concerns has been that because the government has been providing so much support in terms of input subsidies and output guarantees to these monoculture farmers, farmers who want to shift away from that to mixed farming find it very hard. It's almost impossible for them to do so.
Now, wait a
Because
minute.
this,
I'm a little unclear about what this natural farming is. Is it a return to more traditional types of farming before the monoculture came in, or is that that ancient or traditional type of farming compatible with the discoveries now being made about carbon farming and the need to do such things as cover crops and no-till agriculture, et cetera? If we went back to the more traditional system of mixed farming, would it meet the requirements that we're looking for in terms of sustainability and climate change?
so actually, natural farming is an umbrella term, and it includes all the things that you described. Um, Plus, I would say some bit of experiential knowledge that farmers themselves have had. Now, much of that, so I would not want to use the word traditional to describe it, although some of it is historical and traditional. But a lot of it ultimately is hybridized knowledge coming both from agroecology as a science, and all the things that you described, mulching, cover cropping, conservation agriculture, no-till agriculture, but also coming from people's own historical experiences of which were the trees that grew in this region, or what things actually worked with what did you intercrop in the past in different kinds of ways. So it's a mix of all of that. So I wouldn't call this going back to any kind of either ancient or traditional sort of
Well, take
past.
just the question of plowing versus the main goal of people working on climate change now is to sequester more carbon in the soil, which plowing doesn't do. It reverses that. Now, would you with the things that you're proposing, this natural farming, would it handle that issue or not?
So I think there is a large gamut of practices that are part of this system that actually vary according to geography and region. So, some parts of, depending on which region one is in, like in the eastern part of the country where there is a lot more water, there are even cases where one could possibly grow monoculture rice in flooded paddies. But that monoculture rice is actually a fish and rice system where you have fish in those flooded fields, which are, eating the pests in the rice and, working in it, of also providing food. So it's an interesting kind of combination. Now, whether one calls that a monoculture rice system or whether one calls that a rice and fish system, it's a different thing. But my point is that there are a lot of practices that are locally different, and they need to be variable because they have to be suitable to the local geography and the local ecology. So I think, making an argument that, never using the plow or never doing something, it is not quite, I mean, we cannot homogenize this heterogeneity. The ultimate point is to revive the diversity, not only of the foods and the crops, but also the diversity of practices on the farm. And, get more autonomy. Again, it's a question of autonomy in deciding what it is that farming communities and farmers can, in fact, do and work with. To come back to your point about sustainability, not only in terms of the environment, but also in terms of providing food to us, I think the food production question has very narrowly been framed as one of cereals. And I think this is a gift to us from, a certain economic framing that we have had in the past, where the responsibility of the government is to feed people. And, one of the farmers I spoke to, he said something very interesting. This very old farmer who does natural farming and he trains a lot of people. He said, we are talking about feeding people as if people have only a mouth. Don't people also have two hands? You know, people will work and people will, it's important to think of people as thinking working individuals rather than just as mouths to feed. And because we've only thought of people as mouths, we have narrowed it down that, okay, we can do rice, wheat, food grain, we give them food grain, and that's fine. But that has led to such a severe nutrition crisis in our country. In my own work has broadly been looking at the nutritional impacts of the green revolution, and we are having highly polished rice and wheat. We are having a lot more white sugar. All of this now our nutritionists are telling us has contributed quite significantly to an epidemic of type 2 diabetes in the country. And with COVID, we saw the implications for the comorbidities that this holds. You know, diabetes is of course a predisposition for so many other diseases in that sense. And so, we are a nation where 1 out of 5 people is undernourished, but 1 out of 5 people is overweight or obese, and they're suffering from these kinds of diseases. So
Mm.
by looking at food so narrowly, we have missed the boat entirely. And so we have to broaden our conception of what counts as food and broaden our conception of how we need to grow it and what we need to eat, what kind of geographical linkages we need to create to urban consumers, and what consumers.
Okay, I'm focused, situated where I am, obviously largely on climate change issues and the need to use agriculture as a way of sequestering carbon in a hurry, big time, and how to really make a major global transformation toward carbon farming, if you will. And I have had a conversation with a man who is engaged with that too, but his angle on it is he goes to governments, but he also goes to big corporations, food processing corporations, and his answer is that the change that will come toward sustainable farming and carbon sequestration will come as a result of the pressure of food corporations, because they are buying up they have control of most of the produce of farms, and that they are fully aware of the fact that current methods of agriculture are not sustainable, that we will be depleting the soil at such a rate that, 50 years from now, there'll be nothing left to produce anything. And that these corporations are very aware of the need for change. And it is because they can put pressure on the farmers to change their methods of farming that we can look forward to rapid and major global changes. This surprised me because I've always thought that the autonomy of the local farmer in adjusting to whatever he wants, including going back to traditional or natural methods of farming, that is what we wanted to encourage. But from his analysis, I should be happy when a major corporation buys up all the grain, because that means that they're going to have a lot of leverage to press the farmers that they buy from to change their methods. Is this man right, or is there any truth in his argument?
The question of corporations in agriculture is ultimately a question of scale and of standardization. So if you're a corporate buying any kind of product, you want it in a certain quantity and you want it to be of a certain quality so that you can provide a homogenized product to your consumer. And the rise of corporations has been the rise of also a standardized consumer, where a consumer is now expecting that every time I go to the supermarket, I will get the same type of, tomato, which is red and round, or the same type of banana, which is exactly in this shape and this color, or something else. And if you again go back to nature, then nature never produces standardized stuff. It's always variable. Every farmer will tell you that. And that variability is something that historically, if we go back and also look at our food system, was incorporated in our food system. So, there are recipes in India that you make with bananas that are rotting. There are recipes for bananas that are too green. There are recipes for bananas that are just right. You eat them in different ways. You don't just peel a banana and eat it. There are many things you can do with it. But what we have had, and increasingly now in India, is the rise of a consumer who thinks that she is very discerning and she is buying the best quality food, especially when it's coming in a package of some sort, whether it's the plastic packaging on the vegetables or it's the processed biscuits or whatever else processed that we are getting from the market. But what that food chain is, in fact, a food chain of standardization, of reduced diversity, of reduced variability. And that food chain has important implications for the farmer. So I'm quite surprised or rather, I'm a bit confused that if certainly these corporations have a great deal of market power and the ability to dictate terms to farmers. In fact, that's exactly what the farm protests are about. They're saying, well, that's exactly the future that we see if you bring these corporations in. But if they're going to ask the farmer to change, what will the farmer change to? Because the corporation will still tell the farmer that I want a standardized product of a certain size, of a certain grade, of a certain color. And to produce that, a farmer will have to do monoculture farming based on chemicals. If a farmer does some other kind of farming, that grade, that color, that quality will never come out. And even otherwise, even on a monoculture farm, so much of the produce is actually thrown away because it doesn't fit the grade. And so if you are going to do a corporate scale based, standardization based supply chain, the farmer cannot shift. It's a bind. The farmer can only shift if the farmer, in fact, has a market for the 20 or 30 things that the farmer will grow in much smaller quantity. Maybe the companies are not quite sure of how agriculture actually happens on the ground. Now, in countries like the United States, there are very few farmers anyway. Mostly it is, corporations who are holding that land and your workers working those farms. And I'm not quite sure what the implications may be for that. There's organic farming that is done in California. That is large monoculture organic farming, which is, quite surprising, corporate-based organic farming.
No, really? I didn't know about that. Okay.
Which I'm not quite sure how that works. But in India, just to finally sum it up, with our multitudes of farmers, millions of farmers, with our smaller farm holdings, with the real need for livelihoods and bringing in the climate crisis in the situation, I think corporatization is a move towards standardization and monoculture, not a move towards diversity and decentralization, which is what we actually need. And for government policies, I mean, if they can either shift subsidies to this, if they can handhold farmers, give them, the same kind of support they gave during the Green Revolution. See, they moved farmers, right, from mixed farming to monoculture with a whole host of support. If that same kind of support can be given to farmers today to shift, I think farmers will be absolutely ready to shift because they themselves are seeing that this is a sinking hole that they are in, and the next generation does not see any future in farming.
Oh boy. Okay. Well, you've given the hint of a solution, but we need another 2 or 3 hours before I can get a full version of what you would have as a program. This has been wonderful, extremely interesting. I'm going to share it as widely as possible because everybody needs to hear what you've said. Thank you so much. And
Thank
be
you,
in touch.
Mr.
All right.
Thank you
Bye,
so much.
Mr.
It's
Bye.
been a pleasure. Bye-bye.